And I demand that in the Old Testament. Well, really, if you look around, that's a bargain. 10% is a bargain. I was raised in Alberta, and my father and mother came as immigrants into this country in the 50s. And my dad wanted to farm in the worst way. So he, after a few years, found a doctor. The fellow's name was Dr. McKibben, who for a hobby loved to farm. He was a medical doctor, but he farmed as a hobby. And he had this farm. It was a pretty good sized one, but he couldn't run it by himself and do the medical practice. So he said to my dad, "Why don't you rent this place? I'll come and help you run it." And he did. And he says, "I'll come and rent you to help you run it, but you can rent the whole place, but I want a third of the harvest." That's the rent. A third. A third. And that was a good deal. So I remember so well how that went. And my dad got the picture that a third was Doc's and it was not his. I was at that time big enough to drive a truck, but too young to have a license. You know that awkward stage? Every young guy goes through that, more so than girls do. And we had a big truck on the farm, which was used, of course, when combining time came, to haul the grain from the field to the farm. And I could do that as long as I didn't go on any major roads as a 14-year-old. So I wanted to do that because I love that power of that truck. And so my dad said, "Well, that's fine, you can do that." But we had a problem. Every third load had to go into town, and we had to take that to the elevator because that was the docks. And if we did that, I wouldn't be able to drive the truck. So I had it all figured out. I said to Dad, "Dad, let's do it this way this time. Why don't we take all the grain and put it in the bins at home, and then in the wintertime when the snow blows and during the Christmas break, I'll help you haul it to town. We'll haul Doc McKibben's to town then." You see, I had it figured out. Then I could drive the truck. And my dad looked at me and he said, "Don't even go there. That grain does not belong on my yard. It is not mine." Now the Old Testament people had to learn that the 10% was not theirs. They never owned it. It was owned by God and had to go back to God in the form of blessing and extending His kingship and blessing those who were not as blessed as they are. That's the Old Testament principle. And much of the battle and struggle throughout the Old Testament was always over that thing. When God's people were spiritually strong, they were spiritually generous. The minute they went down and they got far from God and got caught up with selfishness and self-centeredness and lost their focus on the big kingdom, then they would become more and more selfish and want to keep everything to themselves. And then God would let them suffer some defeats. They would experience some illnesses, and they would get on their knees and they cry out to God and say, "God, what have we done wrong? What have we done wrong? Why aren't you blessing us? Why aren't you walking with us?" And sometimes He'd let them cry. He'd let them cry and cry until it got so painful that they got on their knees and began to examine their lives. And they discovered they'd become self-centered again. And then a revival would take place. A revival would take place. And you see it all through the Old Testament. These revivals would take place. They would recommit themselves to the Lord. They'd experience His forgiveness. And they would pay the price. And the price, really humorously, was immediately after revival, they would again care for the poor. They would again set aside the tithe. And you know something else they would do? During the times of spiritual apathy, God had said, "I'm going to have a special relationship with you, and every male child born in your community needs to be circumcised as part of the family of God." Well, when they watered that down, circumcision stopped. And guess what? When they got spiritually revitalized, they had to catch up. Ouch. Two things really hurt. Two things really hurt. The catching up on that and the catching up on the tithe. They were not dissimilar. Now Malachi picks that up. Malachi picks that up. And he's now we're at the last book of the Old Testament. And Malachi kind of flows out of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah comes out of a time when God's people have been what we call into the Babylonian captivity. They have been conquered by another group of people, and they have completely, almost, well, not completely, but almost lost their identity, being occupied by foreign people and foreign gods and foreign religions. And they cry out to God and say, God, what have we done? And God said, you've again left me. And they cry out and they begin to come back. And so Nehemiah and Ezra and a number of people go back to Israel, and they rebuild the temple and they rebuild the walls, and they're beginning to come together again. And in Nehemiah chapter 8, there's a huge outpouring of a revival. And out of that revival, because they started reading the scriptures again, out of that revival come four things. One is they say, we will no longer intermarry. One of the problems they had, as soon as they watered down their religion, they became more concerned about what people looked like sexually than what they were like characteristically. And so they were marrying and finding partners with the wrong priorities. And the minute they make a commitment to God, they say, oh God, that's gotten us into trouble. We're really, really watered down. And we've lost a lot of our youth because they've gone another way. And so they make a commitment and say, all right, we will stop this procedure, this process. We will get our priorities straight. We will commit ourselves only to people who are committed to God and establish new homes. Secondly, they decided together that the Sabbath needs to be restored. They've gone from a 6-day week work and a day's rest to a 7th-day week work. That always happens. When you lose sight of what really counts, then work and money becomes all important. And if you can't make it in 6 days, you think you need the 7th day. And what all that it does, it just distorts over 7 days what is already distorted over 6 days. And you don't even have time to think, to rest, to reflect, to become refreshed. So you just live in this world. And God's people said, no more. We're going to do the 6-1 cycle, the rhythm of work, rest. They became concerned for the poor, and they became concerned to restore the tithe. Those are the things. And they did that, and they did it well. Now Malachi comes along 20 years later, and they've again forgotten it. They've again gone back on their old ways. And if you ever read the book of Malachi, and I urge you to do so, they really, really get clobbered. God really sets them straight. In the first chapter, he says to them, you no longer worship me the way I want to be worshipped. Instead of bringing perfect offerings. See, God had said in the Old Testament, I want you to bring the first and the best, not the leftovers. Bring me the first and the best. And God says, I will bless that. And they were bringing them leftovers. Instead of bringing them the best cow or calf or bull in the herd, the $25,000 purebred Hereford, they were bringing them an $800 scrub. And they said, you know, when you put this on the altar and you kill it and you burn it, who would ever know that this is a scrub rather than a purebred? And God says, I do. The offering is not the issue. The heart. The heart is the issue. It always is. This whole matter of money is an issue of the heart. Now we come to Malachi, and Malachi picks it up again in chapter 3. The first chapter he talks about worship. The second chapter, you can read it for yourself, it talks about why you break faith with one another. And that's I love it if your pastor's going to preach on truth-telling, because there's a desperate need for that. We have covered up truth-telling with courtesy and being nice. And much of the niceness is nothing but phoniness. It avoids the truth. We need to hear the truth.